Greetings, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland. Here I am on Lord North Street in London. There's number 5 behind me with that rather handsome door knocker in the shape of a lion's head with a ring in the mouth. Anyway, somebody wanted to know about the alleged conspiracy against Harold Wilson. Well, this is where he lived through most of the 60s and the 70s. Now, he became Prime Minister in 1964, served to 1970, was back again in 1974 and carried on to 1976 as First Lord of the Treasury. So 10 Downing Street was his official residence, and indeed the plate on 10 Downing Street says First Lord of the Treasury. It does not say Prime Minister, because First Lord of the Treasury has been around certainly since 1721. Prime Minister wasn't an official title till, my goodness, about 1910, was recognised in some order of precedence, but colloquially known as Prime Minister. Anyway, so this is where he lived, and became leader of the Labour Party in early 1963, because Hugh Gaitskell died on the 18th of January 1963. He'd returned from a trip to the Soviet Union just after New Year, and he'd immediately fallen ill. He contracted some sort of virus or other, and he died a fortnight later in hospital. It appeared to be lupus, an autoimmune condition, which really his situation deteriorated very rapidly indeed. So he died at the age of 56. Anyway, in the subsequent leadership contest, Harold Wilson came out on top, who'd seen as being one of the most left-wing Labour MPs. Conversely, Hugh Gaitskell was a right-winger within the party and a moderniser, had tried to get it to distance itself from the trades unions, end the block vote and things like that, but he was a generation or even two ahead of himself. It was simply too much for most of the Labour Party to stomach. Anyway, the suspicion was by some that he was Gaitskell was poisoned because the KGB wanted to get their man, their agent, as in Harold Wilson, in. So Harold Wilson in the 1950s had been visiting the Soviet Union repeatedly with Marcia Williams, as she then was. Now, he was known to be close to this woman. She was married. He was married to someone else as well. And they could just be friends. It is possible for a straight man and a straight woman to be platonic friends, that there was no hanky-panky going on. But anyway, the hypothesis is they forgot themselves on at least one occasion, and at a moment of weakness got into bed together and were framed by the KGB, who had photographic evidence of this, and then they were blackmailed and persuaded to act as agents, or even indeed doing it willingly. Now, none of this has ever been proven, but there was a subsequent Soviet defector, Sergei Golitsyn, who came in the early 60s, who said this is the whole thing, and I can't remember who said something similar. Subsequently, Ion Pacepa, that Romanian guy from Securitate, the Romanian Secret Service, when he defected in the early 80s, he told a similar story, and blah, blah, blah. There meant to be several Western leaders whom the Soviet Union had covertly bumped off, not killing them by shooting them, something blatant and irrefutable, but in a way that was deniable, that might look like an illness. I don't know if it's true, but certainly he was suspected by some in MI5 of having sympathies in a communist direction. And so Wilson believed that he was being bugged by MI5, that's the United Kingdom's internal intelligence agency, catching foreign agents and foreign intelligence officers here, whereas MI6 is going overseas and spying on other countries. Anyway, Wilson was Prime Minister, was squeaked home in the 1964 election, and then re-elected handily in 1966, but things started to go badly wrong for him, with the pound losing a lot of its value, with economic stagnation in the late 60s and increasing discontent in its party, somewhat strained relationship with the United States. Bearing in mind, this was the height of the Cold War. The Vietnam conflict was raging. Wilson refused to dispatch troops to the United States. Could it be that LBJ wanted him gone, thought that the Conservative Party would be more amenable to his purposes? Well, just possibly. Anyway, he came back in as Prime Minister in February 1974, and the situation was grave. The Northern Ireland conflict had erupted by that stage. There were a lot of strikes. Stagnation was carrying on in terms of the economy. Inflation was rising. It was all around as a fairly dismal situation. Gone were the sort of rosy days of the early 60s, the boom from 1945 to say 1967. There'd been growth every year, and not much in the way of strikes. But anyway, some people supposedly plotted a military coup. Huey Green, this right-wing entertainer, contacting the British command of the Army of the Rhine, that's to say the British troops who were in West Germany. Remember, Germany being divided until October 1990. Would he help Huey Green overthrow Wilson and the command of the Rhine, tell him not to be such a ninny? Of course he wouldn't. And soundings with Earl Mountbatten of Burma as the former Viceroy of India, who was the Queen's second cousin once removed. Would he be willing to serve as some sort of interim Prime Minister if Wilson were arrested, put under house arrest at Chequers, and there'd be some sort of junta ruling? No, he was not willing to do this. The idea being to declare martial law. In extremis, they could do this and say, oh, Defence of the Realm Act, we can severely circumscribe freedom of the press, and we can suspend habeas corpus. I mean, in the end, none of it happened. Now, it's true that in Northern Ireland, internment was introduced in August 1971 and only phased out by Christmas 1975. So some of this was not unthinkable, and there were military coups around the place at the time. 1967, democracy was overthrown by the colonels in Greece, and remember, even in Western Europe, Portugal and Spain were military dictatorships at the time, and across the world, in Latin America, many African countries and many Asian countries, there were dictatorships. So could it have happened in the United Kingdom? Remember, France almost had a military coup and or a civil war in the early 1960s over the idea of withdrawing from Algeria. So these were hairy times. So Wilson made the shock announcement in April 1976 he was going to stand down as Prime Minister. He'd reached the age of 60, retirement age. He felt that was long enough. So nobody saw that one coming. Perhaps he could no longer take the strain of it, and he thought he would do something far less pressurizing but more lucrative. So that was Wilson. I had a feeling he had a house in Richmond. I often swore I saw a house with his name on it in Richmond, a blue plaque. And I've walked around Richmond Green and I cannot find it, so perhaps memory plays me false. This is Lord North Street, named after another embattled Prime Minister, Blubbery North. Well, the Earl of Guildford was his real title, who was Prime Minister at the time of the American Revolution, and was one of the most tragic figures in British politics, continuously requesting George III to relieve him of his duties, but King George III wouldn't. Said, a Prime Minister is a servant like any other. You're not allowed to simply resign. I won't let you resign. You must carry on serving. One of the things that always fascinates me here is seeing this sign here. You can see it was painted in the Second World War black and then on white, pointing you to the bomb shelter, the public bomb shelter, which, as I suppose, was down these steps, which is now somebody's, is it a basement flat, something like that down there? Okay, and there's another one on the other side. So anything else about Harold Wilson? So he lived on to about 1995, came from Huddersfield, the son of an industrial chemist who was out of work a lot of the time, and Wilson had been to Jesus College, Oxford, that's part of Oxford University, read philosophy, politics and economics, and graduated with a first-class degree. It's a bit like summa cum laude in the United States. Oh yeah, and here's another notice saying public shelters in the vaults under the basements in something street, in this street. So that's Lord North Street. And I remember Jonathan Aitken, a Conservative cabinet minister, I think he was Chief Secretary of the Treasury, also resided in this street in the 1990s. And the media's often camped on his doorstep over various allegations that he had some sort of financial relationship with Mohammed Al Fayed, who paid for his hotel stay at the Paris Ritz, which Fayed owned. Anyway, and there was some libel action by Jonathan Aitken against The Guardian, which Aitken lost, but he perjured himself, eventually prosecuted for that, and spent a few months in prison as a result of it. Read Pride and Perjury by Jonathan Aitken, who has reinvented himself as an evangelical Christian, born again. And wow, isn't that fascinating, that piece? I've only just noticed now. Do you see this sort of flower pot? Looks like it's some sort of ancient Roman artifact. I imagine it's some sort of 18th century facsimile of one. Up there is this church, is it St. John's on Smith Square? I believe it's actually deconsecrated, it's used as a concert hall. Incidentally, that's where Sir James Goldsmith, leader of the referendum party, that's where he had his memorial service in, I think was it 1997, that September or something. Henry Kissinger came and spoke there, Chief Mangosuthu Buthelezi and others. You can see a bit of it on YouTube. And though Harold Wilson lived in this street and these things were affordable for an MP back then, but you're not on your Nelly these days, cost millions, just up the street, around the corner, 22 Smith Square, that was the headquarters of the Conservative Unionist Party for years, up until about 2005, when Michael Howard moved it out to Victoria Street, to a very nondescript office block, but much harder for protesters to get in and occupy. And Labour even had their headquarters in that street, in Transport House on that street in the late 1940s, just after the Second World War. So this place is sort of densely packed with places of political significance. Parliament's hard by. You can't see it really. Just the other side of this building is the Houses of Parliament. So that's enough about the plot against Harold Wilson, the supposed plot, never actually proven. And after he stood down from Parliament, he told the whole story to some journalists, thinking they wouldn't publish it this time. There were numerous documentaries about it. Sergei Golitsyn's allegations that have never been proven. I mean, they've been never comprehensively refuted either. What else? So, yeah, Wilson died in 95. His wife only died 2 years ago, Mary. His 2 sons are alive, one of whom was a train driver. They were at Balliol in the 70s. Well, one of his sons, I think Robert, was at Balliol. Anything else I should point out about the alleged plot against Harold Wilson? That's the size of it. Obviously, James Callaghan took over. No relation, I'm pleased to say, Lord Callaghan of Cardiff. Whose surname wasn't really Callaghan. His great-grandfather ran away to sea and changed it from something that sounds something like Carrigan to prevent his parents tracing him. Okay, I think that's enough about the Harold Wilson allegations right now. Though incidentally, when he did stand down as Prime Minister, in his resignation honours, he had his dear friend Marcia Faulkner raised to the peerage. It became peeress as Baroness Faulkner, the lavender list, so-called because supposedly written on lavender paper. Lavender-coloured paper. Okay, so please subscribe. It's absolutely essential to subscribe. Thank you for your donations on Patreon and PayPal and so forth. And book me for lessons in any of the humanities, French, law, and so forth. Get me to translate for you from French, Spanish, Italian, Romanian, German, and Russian. And what else? I'll be your tour guide in London. Toodle pip.